Chapter 33 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Belinda Brown, Indianapolis, Indiana. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 33. More links. The barley was all carried at last, and the harvest suppers went without waiting for the dismal black crop of beans. The apples and nuts were gathered and stored, the scent of whey departed from the farmhouses, and the scent of brewing came in its stead. The wood behind the chaise, and all the hedgerow trees, took on a solemn splendor under the dark, low-hanging skies. Michaelmas was come, with its fragrant basketfuls of purple damsons and its paler purple daisies, and its lads and lasses leaving or seeking service, and winding along between the yellow hedges with their bundles under their arms. But though Michaelmas was come, Mr. Thurl, that desirable tenant, did not come to the Chase farm, and the old squire, after all, had been obliged to put in a new bailiff. It was known throughout the two parishes that the squire's plan had been frustrated, because the Poysers had refused to be put upon, and Mrs. Poyser's outbreak was discussed in all the farmhouses with a zest which was only heightened by frequent repetition. The news that Boney was come back from Egypt was comparatively insipid, and the repulse of the French in Italy was nothing to Mrs. Poyser's repulse of the old squire. Mr. Irwine had heard a version of it in every parishioner's house, with one exception of the Chase. But since he had always, with marvellous skill, avoided any quarrel with the Donnithornes, he could not allow himself the pleasure of laughing at the old gentleman's discomfiture with anyone besides his mother, who declared that if she were rich she should like to allow Mrs. Poyser a pension for life, and wanted to invite her to the parsonage that she might hear an account of the scene from Mrs. Poyser's own lips. "No, no, mother," said Mr. Irwine. "It was a little bit of irregular justice on Mrs. Poyser's part, but a magistrate like me must not countenance irregular justice. There must be no report spread that I have taken notice of the quarrel, else I shall lose the little good influence I have over the old man." "Well, I like that woman even better than her cream cheeses," said Mrs. Irwine. "She has the spirit of 3 men, with that pale face of hers, and she says such sharp things, too." "Sharp!" "Yes, her tongue is like a new-set razor. She's quite original in her talk, too, one of those untaught wits that help to stock a country with proverbs. I told you that capital thing I heard her say about Craig, that he was like a cock, who thought the sun had risen to hear him crow. Now that's an Aesop's fable in a sentence." "But it will be a bad business if the old gentleman turns them out of the farm next Michaelmas, said Mrs. Irwine. "Oh, that must not be, and Poyser is such a good tenant that Donnithorne is likely to think twice, and digest his spleen rather than turn them out. But if he should give them notice at Lady Day, Arthur and I must move heaven and earth to mollify him. Such old parishioners as they are must not go." "Ah, there's no knowing what may happen before Lady Day," said Mrs. Irwine. "It struck me on Arthur's birthday that the old man was a little shaken. He's 83, you know. It's really an unconscionable age. It's only women who have the right to live as long as that." "When they've got old bachelor sons who would be forlorn without them," said Mr. Irwine, laughing and kissing his mother's hand. Mrs. Poyser, too, met her husband's occasional forebodings of a notice to quit with, "There's no knowing what may happen before Lady Day," one of those undeniable general propositions which are usually intended to convey a particular meaning very far from undeniable. But it's really too hard upon a human nature that it should be held a criminal offence to imagine the death even of the king when he has turned 83. It is not to be believed that any but the dullest Britons can be good subjects under that hard condition. Apart from this foreboding, things went on much as usual at the Poyser household. Mrs. Poyser thought she noticed a surprising improvement in Hetty. To be sure, the girls got closer tempered, and sometimes she seemed as if there was no drawing a word from her with cart ropes. But she thought much less about her dress, and went after the work quite eagerly, without any telling. And it was wonderful how she never wanted to go out now. indeed, could hardly be persuaded to go, and she bore her aunt's putting a stop to her weekly lessons and fine work at the Chase without the least grumbling or pouting. It must be, after all, that she had set her heart on Adam at last, and her sudden freak of wanting to be a lady's maid must have been caused by some little pique or misunderstanding between them, which had passed by. For whenever Adam came to the Hall Farm, Hetty seemed to be in better spirits, and talked more than at other times, though she was almost sullen when Mr. Craig or any other admirer happened to pay a visit there. Adam himself watched her at first with trembling anxiety, which gave way to surprise and delicious hope. 5 days after delivering Arthur's letter, he had ventured to go to the Hall Farm again, not without dread lest the sight of him might be painful to her. She was not in the house-place when he entered, and he sat talking to Mr. and Mrs. Poyser for a few minutes, with a heavy fear on his heart that they might presently tell him Hetty was ill. But by and by there came a light step that he knew, and when Mrs. Poyser said, "Come, Hetty, where have you been?" Adam was obliged to turn round, though he was afraid to see the changed look there must be in her face. He almost started when he saw her smiling as if she were pleased to see him, looking the same as ever at a first glance, only that she had her cap on, which he had never seen her in before when he came of an evening. Still, when he looked at her again, and again as she moved about or sat at her work, there was a change. The cheeks were as pink as ever, and she smiled as much as she had ever done of late, but there was something different in her eyes, in the expression of her face, in all her movements. Adam thought, something harder, older, less childlike. "Poor thing," he said to himself, "that's allays likely. It's because she's had her first heartache. But she's got a spirit to bear up under it. Thank God for that." As the weeks went by, and he saw her always looking pleased to see him, turning up her lovely face towards him, as if she meant him to understand that she was glad for him to come, and going about her work in that same equable way, making no sign of sorrow, he began to believe that her feelings toward Arthur must have been much slighter than he had imagined in his first indignation and alarm, and that she had been able to think of her girlish fancy that Arthur was in love with her and would marry her as a folly of which she was timely cured. And it perhaps was, as he had sometimes in his more cheerful moments hoped it would be. Her heart was really turning with all the more warmth towards the man she knew to have a serious love for her. Possibly you think that Adam was not at all sagacious in his interpretations, and that it was altogether extremely unbecoming in a sensible man to behave as he did, falling in love with a girl who really had nothing more than her beauty to recommend her, attributing imaginary virtues to her, and even condescending to cleave to her after she had fallen in love with another man, waiting for her kind looks as a patient, trembling dog waits for his master's eyes to be turned upon him. But in so complex a thing as human nature, we must consider, it is hard to find rules without exceptions. Of course, I know that, as a rule, sensible men fall in love with the most sensible women of their acquaintance, see through all the pretty deceits of coquettish beauty, never imagine themselves loved when they are not loved, cease loving on all proper occasions, and marry the woman most fitted for them in every respect. Indeed, so as to compel the approbation of all the maiden ladies in their neighbourhood. But even to this rule an exception will occur now and then in the lapse of centuries, and my friend Adam was one. For my own part, however, I respect him none the less. Nay, I think the deep love he had for that sweet, rounded, blossom-like, dark-eyed Hetty, of whose inward self he was really very ignorant, came out of the strength of his nature, and not out of any inconsistent weakness. Is it any weakness, pray, to be wrought on by exquisite music, to feel its wondrous harmonies searching the subtlest windings of your soul, the delicate fibres of life where no memory can penetrate, and binding together your whole being, past and present, in one unspeakable vibration, melting you in one moment with all the tenderness, all the love that has been scattered through toilsome years, concentrating in one emotion of heroic courage or resignation, all the heart-learned lessons of renouncing sympathy, blending your present joy with past sorrow, and your present sorrow with all your past joy? If not, then neither is it a weakness to be so wrought upon by the exquisite curves of a woman's cheek and neck and arms, by the liquid depths of her beseeching eyes, or the sweet childish pout of her lips. For the beauty of a lovely woman is like music. What can one say more? Beauty has an expression beyond and far above the one woman soul that it clothes. As the words of genius have a wider meaning than the thoughts that prompted them, it is more than a woman's love that moves us in a woman's eyes. It seems to be a far-off, mighty love that has come near to us and made speech for itself there. The rounded neck, the dimpled arms, move us by something more than their prettiness, by their close kinship with all we have known of tenderness and peace. The noblest nature sees the most of this impersonal expression in beauty. It is needless to say that there are gentlemen with whiskers dyed and undyed who see none of it whatever, and for this reason the noblest nature is often the most blinded to the character of the one woman's soul that the beauty clothes. Whence, I fear, the tragedy of human life is likely to continue for a long time to come, in spite of mental philosophers who are ready with the best receipts for avoiding all mistakes of the kind. Our good Adam had no fine words into which he could put his feelings for Hetty. He could not disguise mystery in this way with the appearance of knowledge. He called his love frankly a mystery, as you have heard him. He only knew that the sight and memory of her moved him deeply, touching the spring of all love and tenderness, all faith and courage within him. How could he imagine narrowness, selfishness, hardness in her? He created the mind he believed in out of his own, which was large, unselfish, tender. The hopes he felt about Hetty softened a little his feelings toward Arthur. Surely his attentions to Hetty must have been of a slight kind. They were altogether wrong, and such as no man in Arthur's position ought to have allowed himself, but they must have had an air of playfulness about them, which had probably blinded him to their danger, and had prevented them from laying any strong hold on Hetty's heart. As the new promise of happiness rose for Adam, his indignation and jealousy began to die out. Hetty was not made unhappy. He almost believed that she liked him best, and the thought sometimes crossed his mind that the friendship which had once seemed dead forever might revive in the days to come, and he would not have to say good-bye to the grand old woods, but would like them better because they were Arthur's. For this new promise of happiness, following so quickly on the shock of pain, had an intoxicating effect on the sober Adam, who had all his life been used to much hardship and moderate hope. Was he really going to have an easy lot after all? It seemed so, for at the beginning of November Jonathan Burge, finding it impossible to replace Adam, had at last made up his mind to offer him a share in the business, without further condition than that he should continue to give his energies to it, and renounce all thought of having a separate business of his own. Son-in-law or no son-in-law, Adam had made himself too necessary to be parted with, and his head work was so much more important to Burge than his skill and handicraft, that his having the management of the woods made little difference in the value of his services. And as to the bargain about the squire's timber, it would be easy to call in a third person. Adam saw here an opening into a broadening path of prosperous work, such as he thought of with ambitious longing ever since he was a lad. He might come to build a bridge, or a town hall, or a factory, for he had always said to himself that Jonathan Burge's building business was like an acorn, which might be the mother of a great tree. So he gave his hand to Burge on that bargain, and went home with his mind full of happy visions, in which, my refined reader will perhaps be shocked when I say it, the image of Hetty hovered, and smiled over plans for seasoning timber at a trifling expense, calculations as to the cheapening of bricks per thousand by water carriage, and a favourite scheme for the strengthening of roofs and walls with a peculiar form of iron girder. What then? Adam's enthusiasm lay in these things, and our love is inwrought in our enthusiasm as electricity is inwrought in the air, exalting its power by subtle presence. Adam would be able to take a separate house now, and provide for his mother in the old one. His prospects would justify his marrying very soon, and if Dinah consented to have Seth, their mother would perhaps be more contented to live apart from Adam. But he told himself that he would not be hasty. He would not try Hetty's feelings for him until it had had time to grow strong and firm. However, tomorrow, after church, he would go to the Hall Farm and tell them the news. Mr. Poyser, he knew, would like it better than a £5 note, and he should see if Hetty's eyes brightened at it. The months would be short with all he had to fill his mind, and this foolish eagerness, which had come over him of late, must not hurry him into any premature words. Yet, when he got home and told his mother the good news, and ate his supper, while she sat by almost crying for joy, and wanting him to eat twice as much as usual because of his good luck, He could not help preparing her gently for the coming change by talking of the old house being too small for them all to go on living in it always. End of chapter 33. Reading by Belinda Brown of Indianapolis, Indiana.
Of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 34. The Betrothal. It was a dry Sunday, and really a pleasant day for the 2nd of November. There was no sunshine, but the clouds were high, and the wind was so still that the yellow leaves which fluttered down from the hedgerow elms must have fallen from pure decay. Nevertheless, Mrs. Poyser did not go to church, for she had taken a cold too serious to be neglected. Only 2 winters ago she had been laid up for weeks with a cold. And since his wife did not go to church, Mr. Poyser considered that on the whole it would be as well for him to stay away too, and keep her company. He could perhaps have given no precise form to the reasons that determined this conclusion, but it is well known to all experienced minds that our firmest convictions are often dependent on subtle impressions for which words are quite too coarse a medium. However it was, no one from the Poyser family went to church that afternoon except Hetty and the boys. Yet Adam was bold enough to join them after church, and say that he would walk home with them, though all the way through the village he appeared to be chiefly occupied with Marty and Tommy, telling them about the squirrels in Binton Coppice, and promising to take them there some day. But when they came to the fields, he said to the boys, "Now then, which is the stoutest walker? Him as gets the home gate first shall be the first to go with me to Binton Coppice on the donkey. But Tommy must have the start up to the next stile, because he's the smallest." Adam had never behaved so much like a determined lover before. As soon as the boys had both set off, he looked down at Hetty and said, "Won't you hang on my arm, Hetty?" in a pleading tone, as if he had already asked her and she had refused. Hetty looked up at him smilingly and put her round arm through his in a moment. It was nothing to her, putting her arm through Adam's, but she knew he cared a great deal about having her arm through his, and she wished him to care. Her heart beat no faster, and she looked at the half-bare hedgerows and the ploughed field with the same sense of oppressive dullness as before. But Adam scarcely felt that he was walking. He thought Hetty must know that he was pressing her arm a little, a very little. Words rushed to his lips that he dared not utter, that he had made up his mind not to utter yet, and so he was silent for the length of that field. The calm patience with which he had once waited for Hetty's love, content only with her presence and the thought of the future, had forsaken him since that terrible shock nearly 3 months ago. The agitations of jealousy had given a new restlessness to his passion, had made fear and uncertainty too hard almost to bear. But though he might not speak to Hetty of his love, he would tell her about his new prospects and see if she would be pleased. So when he was enough master of himself to talk, he said, "I'm going to tell your uncle some news that'll surprise him, Hetty, and I think you'll be glad to hear it too." "What's that?" Hetty said indifferently. "Why, Mr. Burge has offered me a share in his business, and I'm going to take it." There was a change in Hetty's face, certainly not produced by any agreeable impression from this news. In fact, she felt a momentary annoyance and alarm, for she had so often heard it hinted by her uncle that Adam might have Mary Burge and a share in the business any day if he liked, that she associated the two objects now, and the thought immediately occurred that perhaps Adam had given her up because of what had happened lately, and had turned towards Mary Burge. With that thought, and before she had time to remember any reasons why it could not be true, came a new sense of forsakenness and disappointment. The one thing, the one person, her mind had rested on in its dull weariness, had slipped away from her, and peevish misery filled her eyes with tears. She was looking on the ground, but Adam saw her face, saw the tears, and before he had finished saying, "Hetty, dear Hetty, what are you crying for?" his eager, rapid thought had flown through all the causes conceivable to him, and had at last alighted on half the true one. Hetty thought he was going to marry Mary Burge. She didn't like him to marry. Perhaps she didn't like him to marry any one but herself. All caution was swept away, all reason for it was gone, and Adam could feel nothing but trembling joy. He leaned towards her and took her hand as he said, "I could afford to be married now, Hetty. I could make a wife comfortable, but I shall never want to be married if you won't have me." Hetty looked up at him and smiled through her tears, as she had done to Arthur that first evening in the wood, when she had thought he was not coming, and yet he came. It was a feebler relief, a feebler triumph she felt now, but the great dark eyes and the sweet lips were as beautiful as ever, perhaps more beautiful, for there was a more luxuriant womanliness about Hetty of late. Adam could hardly believe in the happiness of that moment. His right hand held her left, and he pressed her arm close against his heart as he leaned down towards her. "Do you really love me, Hetty? Will you be my own wife, to love and take care of as long as I live?" Hetty did not speak, but Adam's face was very close to hers, and she put up her round cheek against his like a kitten. She wanted to be caressed. She wanted to feel as if Arthur were with her again. Adam cared for no words after that, and they hardly spoke through the rest of the walk. He only said, "I may tell your uncle and aunt, mayn't I, Hetty?" And she said yes. The red firelight on the hearth at the Hall Farm shone on joyful faces that evening, when Hetty was gone upstairs and Adam took the opportunity of telling Mr. and Mrs. Poyser and the grandfather that he saw his way to maintaining a wife now, and that Hetty had consented to have him. "I hope you have no objections against me for her husband," said Adam. "I'm a poor man as yet, but she shall want nothing as I can work for." "Objections?" said Mr. Poyser, while the grandfather leaned forward and brought out his nay. "What objections can we have to you, lad? Never mind you being poorish as yet. There's money in your headpiece as there's money in the sown field. But it must have time. You'n got enough to begin on, and we can do a deal toward the bit of furniture you want. Thee's got feathers and linen to spare, plenty, eh?" This question was of course addressed to Mrs. Poyser, who was wrapped up in a warm shawl, and was too hoarse to speak with her usual facility. At first she only nodded emphatically, but she was presently unable to resist the temptation to be more explicit. "It'd be a poor tale if I hadn't feathers and linen," she said hoarsely, "when I never sell a fowl but what's plucked, and the wheels a going every day of the week." "Come, my wench," said Mr. Poyser, when Hetty came down. "Come and kiss us, and let us wish you luck." Hetty went very quietly and kissed the big good-natured man. "There," he said, patting her on the back, "go and kiss your aunt and your grandfather. I'm as wishful to have you settled well as if you was my own daughter, and so's your aunt, I'll be bound, for she's done by you this 7 year, Hetty, as if you'd been her own. Come, come, now," he went on, becoming jocose, as soon as Hetty had kissed her aunt and the old man. "Adam wants a kiss too, I'll warrant, and he's a right to one now." Hetty turned away, smiling, towards her empty chair. "Come, Adam, then, take one," persisted Mr. Poyser, "else you aren't half a man." Adam got up, blushing like a small maiden, great strong fellow as he was, and putting his arm round Hetty, stooped down and gently kissed her lips. It was a pretty scene in the red firelight, for there were no candles. Why should there be, when the fire was so bright and was reflected from all the pewter and the polished oak? No one wanted to work on a Sunday evening. Even Hetty felt something like contentment in the midst of all this love. Adam's attachment to her, Adam's caress, stirred no passion in her, were no longer enough to satisfy her vanity, but they were the best her life offered her now. They promised her some change. There was a great deal of discussion before Adam went away, about the possibility of his finding a house that would do for him to settle in. No house was empty except the one next to Will Maskery's in the village, and that was too small for Adam now. Mr. Poyser insisted that the best plan would be for Seth and his mother to move and leave Adam in the old home, which might be enlarged after a while, for there was plenty of space in the woodyard and garden. But Adam objected to turning his mother out. "Well, well," said Mr. Poyser at last, "we needn't fix everything to-night. We must take time to consider. You can't think of getting married afore Easter. I'm not for long courtships, but there must be a bit of time to make things comfortable." "Aye, to be sure," said Mrs. Poyser in a hoarse whisper. "Christian folks can't be married like cuckoos, I reckon." "I'm a bit daunted, though," said Mr. Poyser, "when I think as we may have notice to quit, and belike be forced to take a farm 20 mile off." "Eh?" said the old man, staring at the floor and lifting his hands up and down, while his arms rested on the elbows of his chair. "It's a poor tale if I mun leave the old spot and be buried in a strange parish. And you'll happen to double rates to pay," he added, looking up at his son. "Well, thee mustna fret beforehand, father," said Martin the younger. "Happen the captain'll come home and make our peace with the old squire. I build upon that, for I know the captain will see folks righted if he can." End of chapter 34. Of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 35. The Hidden Dread. It was a busy time for Adam, the time between the beginning of November and the beginning of February, and he could see little of Hetty, except on Sundays. But a happy time nevertheless, for it was taking him nearer and nearer to March, when they were to be married, and all the little preparations for their new housekeeping marked the progress towards the longed-for day. 2 new rooms had been run up to the old house, for his mother and Seth were to live with them after all. Lisbeth had cried so piteously at the thought of leaving Adam that he had gone to Hetty and asked her if, for the love of him, she would put up with his mother's ways and consent to live with her. To his great delight, Hetty said, "Yes, I'd as soon she lived with us as not." Hetty's mind was oppressed at that moment with a worse difficulty than poor Lisbeth's ways. She could not care about them. So Adam was consoled for the disappointment he had felt when Seth had come back from his visit to Snowfield and said, "It was no use. Dinah's heart wasn't turned towards marrying." For when he had told his mother that Hetty was willing they should all live together and there was no more need of them to think of parting, she said, in a more contented tone, that he had heard her speak in since it had been settled that he was to be married. "Eh, my lad, I'll be as still as the old tabby, and ne'er want to do aught but the awful work, as she won't like to do. And then we needn't part the platters and things, as a stood on the shelf together sin afore thee wast born." There was only one cloud that now and then came across Adam's sunshine. Hetty seemed unhappy sometimes, but to all his anxious, tender questions she replied with an assurance that she was quite contented and wished nothing different, and the next time he saw her she was more lively than usual. It might be that she was a little overdone with work and anxiety now, for soon after Christmas Mrs. Poyser had taken another cold, which had brought on inflammation, and this illness had confined her to her room all through January. Hetty had to manage everything downstairs, and half supply Molly's place too, while the good damsel waited on her mistress, and she seemed to throw herself so entirely into her new functions, working with a grave steadiness which was new in her, that Mr. Poyser often told Adam she was wanting to show him what a good housekeeper he would have. But he doubted the lass was overdoing it. She must have a bit of rest when her aunt could come downstairs. This desirable event of Mrs. Poyser's coming downstairs happened in the early part of February, when some mild weather thawed the last patch of snow on the Binton Hills. On one of these days, soon after her aunt came down, Hetty went to Treddleston to buy some of the wedding things which were wanting, and which Mrs. Poyser had scolded her for neglecting, observing that she supposed it was because they were not for the outside, else she'd have bought 'em fast enough. It was about 10 o'clock when Hetty set off, and the slight hoar-frost that had whitened the hedges in the early morning had disappeared as the sun mounted the cloudless sky. Bright February days have a stronger charm of hope about them than any other days in the year. One likes to pause in the mild rays of the sun, and look over the gates at the patient plough-horses turning at the end of the furrow, and think that the beautiful year is all before one. The birds seem to feel just the same. Their notes are as clear as the clear air. There are no leaves on the trees and hedgerows, but how green all the grassy fields are, and the dark purplish brown of the ploughed earth and of the bare branches is beautiful too. What a glad world this looks like as one drives or rides along the valleys and over the hills. I have often thought so when, in foreign countries, where the fields and woods have looked to me like our English Loamshire, the rich land tilled with just as much care, the woods rolling down the gentle slopes of the green meadows. I have come on something by the roadside which has reminded me that I am not in Loamshire, an image of a great agony, the agony of the cross. It has stood perhaps by the clustering apple blossoms, or in the broad sunshine by the cornfield, or at the turning by the wood where a clear brook was gurgling below. And surely, if there came a traveller to this world who knew nothing of the story of man's life upon it, this image of agony would seem to him strangely out of place in the midst of this joyous nature. He would not know that hidden behind the apple blossoms, or among the golden corn, or under the shrouding boughs of the wood, there might be a human heart beating heavily with anguish, perhaps a young blooming girl, not knowing where to turn for refuge from swift advancing shame, understanding no more of this life of ours than a foolish lost lamb wandering farther and farther in the nightfall on the lonely heath, yet tasting the bitterest of life's bitterness. Such things are sometimes hidden among the sunny fields and behind the blossoming orchards, and the sound of the gurgling brook, if you came close to one spot behind a small bush, would be mingled for your ear with a despairing human sob. No wonder man's religion has much sorrow in it, no wonder he needs a suffering God. Hetty, in her red cloak and warm bonnet, with her basket in hand, is turning towards a gate by the side of the Treddleston road, but not that she may have a more lingering enjoyment of the sunshine and think with hope of the long unfolding year. She hardly knows that the sun is shining, and for weeks now, when she has hoped at all, it has been for something at which she herself trembles and shudders. She only wants to be out of the high road, that she may walk slowly and not care how her face looks, as she dwells on wretched thoughts, and through this gate she can get into a field path behind the wide, thick hedgerows. Her great dark eyes wander blankly over the fields like the eyes of one who is desolate, homeless, unloved, not the promised bride of a brave, tender man. But there are no tears in them. Her tears were all wept away in the weary night, before she went to sleep. At the next stile the pathway branches off. There are two roads before her, one along by the hedgerow, which will by and by lead her into the road again, the other across the fields, which will take her much farther out of the way into the scantlands, low-shrouded pastures, where she will see nobody. She chooses this and begins to walk a little faster, as if she had suddenly thought of an object towards which it was worth while to hasten. Soon she is in the scantlands, where the grassy land slopes gradually downwards, and she leaves the level ground to follow the slope. Farther on there is a clump of trees on the low ground, and she is making her way towards it. No, it is not a clump of trees, but a dark shrouded pool, so full with the wintry rains that the underboughs of the elder bushes lie low beneath the water. She sits down on the grassy bank, against the stooping stem of the great oak that hangs over the dark pool. She has thought of this pool often in the nights of the month that has just gone by, and now at last she has come to see it. She clasps her hands round her knees, and leans forward and looks earnestly at it, as if trying to guess what sort of bed it would make for her young round limbs. No, she has not courage to jump into that cold watery bed, and if she had, they might find her. They might find out why she had drowned herself. There is but one thing left to her. She must go away, go where they can't find her. After the first oncoming of her great dread, some weeks after her betrothal to Adam, she had waited and waited in the blind vague hope that something would happen to set her free from her terror, but she could wait no longer. All the force of her nature had been concentrated on the one effort of concealment, and she had shrunk with irresistible dread from every course that could tend towards a betrayal of her miserable secret. Whenever the thought of writing to Arthur had occurred to her, she had rejected it. He could do nothing for her that would shelter her from discovery and scorn among the relatives and neighbours who once more made all her world. Now her airy dream had vanished. Her imagination no longer saw happiness with Arthur, for he could do nothing that would satisfy or soothe her pride. No, something else would happen, something must happen, to set her free from this dread. In young, childish, ignorant souls, there is constantly this blind trust in some unshapen chance. It is as hard to a boy or a girl to believe that a great wretchedness will actually befall them, as to believe that they will die. But now necessity was pressing hard upon her. Now the time of her marriage was close at hand. She could no longer rest in this blind trust. She must run away. She must hide herself where no familiar eyes could detect her. And then the terror of wandering out into the world, of which she knew nothing, made the possibility of going to Arthur a thought which brought some comfort with it. She felt so helpless now, so unable to fashion the future for herself, that the prospect of throwing herself on him had a relief in it which was stronger than her pride. As she sat by the pool and shuddered at the dark cold water, the hope that he would receive her tenderly, that he would care for her and think for her, was like a sense of lulling warmth that made her for the moment indifferent to everything else, and she began now to think of nothing but the scheme by which she should get away. She had had a letter from Dinah lately, full of kind words about the coming marriage, which she had heard of from Seth, and when Hetty had read this letter aloud to her uncle, he had said, "I wish Dinah had come again now, for she'd be a comfort to your aunt when you're gone. What do you think, my wench, o' going to see her as soon as you can be spared, and persuading her to come back with you? You might happen persuade her with telling her as your aunt wants her, for all she writes o' not being able to come." Hetty had not liked the thought of going to Snowfield, and felt no longing to see Dinah, so she only said, "It's so far off, uncle." But now she thought this proposed visit would serve as a pretext for going away. She would tell her aunt when she got home again that she should like the change of going to Snowfield for a week or 10 days. And then, when she got to Stoniton, where nobody knew her, she would ask for the coach that would take her on the way to Windsor. Arthur was at Windsor, and she would go to him. As soon as Hetty had determined on a scheme, she rose from the grassy bank of the pool, took up her basket, and went on her way to Treddleston, for she must buy the wedding things she had come out for, though she would never want them. She must be careful not to raise any suspicion that she was going to run away. Mrs. Poyser was quite agreeably surprised that Hetty wished to go and see Dinah and try to bring her back to stay over the wedding. The sooner she went the better, since the weather was pleasant now, and Adam, when he came in the evening, said if Hetty could set off tomorrow, he would make time to go with her to Treddleston and see her safe into the Stoniton coach. "I wish I could go with you and take care of you, Hetty," he said the next morning, leaning in at the coach door. "But you won't stay much beyond the week. The time will seem long." He was looking at her fondly, and his strong hand held hers in its grasp. Hetty felt a sense of protection in his presence. She was used to it now. If she could have had the past undone and know no other love than her quiet liking for Adam. The tears rose as she gave him the last look. "God bless her for loving me," said Adam, as he went on his way to work again, with Gyp at his heels. But Hetty's tears were not for Adam, not for the anguish that would come upon him when he found she was gone from him forever. They were for the misery of her own lot, which took her away from this brave, tender man who offered up his whole life to her, and threw her, a poor helpless suppliant, on the man who would think it a misfortune that she was obliged to cling to him. At 3 o'clock that day, when Hetty was on the coach that was to take her, they said, to Leicester, part of the long, long way to Windsor, she felt dimly that she might be travelling all this weary journey towards the beginning of a new misery. Yet Arthur was at Windsor. He would surely not be angry with her. If he did not mind about her as he used to do, he had promised to be good to her. End of chapter 35.
Chapter 36 of Adam Bede. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tony Ashworth, Brisbane, Australia. Adam Bede by George Eliot. Chapter 36. The Journey of Hope. A long, lonely journey with sadness in the heart, away from the familiar to the strange. That is a hard and dreary thing even to the rich, the strong, the instructed. A hard thing even when we are called by duty, not urged by dread. What was it then to Hetty? With her poor narrow thoughts, no longer melting into vague hopes, but pressed upon the chill of definite fear, repeating again and again the same small round of memories, shaping again and again the same childish, doubtful images of what was to come, seeing nothing in this wide world but the little history of her own pleasures and pains, with so little money in her pocket, and the way so long and difficult. Unless she could afford always to go in the coaches, and she felt sure she could not, for the journey to Stoniton was more expensive than she had expected, it was plain that she must trust to carriers' carts or slow waggons, and what a time it would be before she could get to the end of her journey. The burly old coachman from Oakbourne, seeing such a pretty young woman among the outside passengers, had invited her to come and sit beside him, and feeling that it became him as a man and a coachman to open the dialogue with a joke, he applied himself as soon as they were off the stones to the elaboration of one suitable in all respects. After many cuts with his whip and glances at Hetty out of the corner of his eye, he lifted his lips above the edge of his wrapper and said, "He's pretty nigh 6 foot, I'll be bound. Isna he now?" "Who?" said Hetty, rather startled. "Why, the sweetheart as you've left behind, or else him as you're going arter. Which is it?" Hetty felt her face flushing and then turned pale. She thought this coachman must know something about her. He must know Adam, and might tell him where she was gone, for it is difficult to country people to believe that those who make a figure in their own parish are not known everywhere else, and it was equally difficult to Hetty to understand that chance words could happen to apply closely to her circumstances. She was too frightened to speak. "Hey, hey," said the coachman, seeing that his joke was not so gratifying as he had expected. "You munna take it too serious. If he's behaved ill, get another. Such a pretty lass as you can get a sweetheart any day." Hetty's fear was allayed by and by, when she found that the coachman made no further allusion to her personal concerns, but it still had the effect of preventing her from asking him what were the places on the road to Windsor. She told him she was only going a little way out of Stoniton, and when she got down at the inn where the coach stopped, she hastened away with a basket to another part of the town. When she had formed her plan of going to Windsor, she had not foreseen any difficulties except that of getting away, and after she had overcome this by proposing the visit to Dinah, her thoughts flew to the meeting with Arthur and the question how he would behave to her, not resting on any probable incidents of the journey. She was too entirely ignorant of travelling to imagine any of its details, and with all her store of money, her 3 guineas, in her pocket, she thought herself amply provided. It was not until she found how much it cost her to get to Stoniton that she began to be alarmed about the journey, and then for the first time she felt her ignorance as to the places that must be passed on her way. Oppressed with this new alarm, she walked along the grim Stoniton streets, and at last turned into a shabby little inn where she hoped to get a cheap lodging for the night. Here she asked the landlord if he could tell her what places she must go to get to Windsor. "Well, I can't rightly say. Windsor must be pretty nigh London, for it's where the king lives," was the answer. "Anyhow, you'd best go to Ashby next. That's south'ard. But there's as many places from here to London as there's houses in Stoniton, by what I can make out. I've never been no traveller myself. But how comes a lone young woman like you to be thinking o' taking such a journey as that?" "I'm going to my brother. He's a soldier at Windsor," said Hetty, frightened at the landlord's questioning look. "I can't afford to go by the coach. Do you think there's a cart goes toward Ashby in the morning?" "Yes, there may be carts if anybody knowed where they started from, but you might run over the town before you found out. You'd best set off and walk, and trust to summat overtaking you." Every word sank like lead on Hetty's spirits. She saw the journey stretch bit by bit before her now. Even to get to Ashby seemed a hard thing. It might take the day, for what she knew, and that was nothing to the rest of the journey. But it must be done. She must get to Arthur. Oh, how she yearned to be again with somebody who would care for her. She who had never got up in the morning without the certainty of seeing familiar faces, people on whom she had an acknowledged claim, whose farthest journey had been to Rossiter on the pillion with her uncle, whose thoughts had always been taking holiday in dreams of pleasure, because all the business of her life was managed for her, this kitten-like Hetty, who till a few months ago had never felt any other grief than that of envying Mary Burge a new ribbon, or being girded at by her aunt for neglecting Totty, who must now make her toilsome way in loneliness, her peaceful home left behind for ever, and nothing but a tremulous hope of distant refuge before her. Now, for the first time, as she lay down tonight in the strange hard bed, she felt that her home had been a happy one, that her uncle had been very good to her, that her quiet lot at Hayslope, among the things and people she knew, with her little pride in her one best gown and bonnet, and nothing to hide from any one, was what she would like to wake up to as a reality, and find that all the feverish life she had known besides was a short nightmare. She thought of all she had left behind with yearning regret for her own sake. Her own misery filled her heart. There was no room in it for other people's sorrow. And yet, before the cruel letter, Arthur had been so tender and loving. The memory of that had still a charm for her, though it was no more than a soothing draught that just made pain bearable. For Hetty could conceive no other existence for herself in future than a hidden one, and a hidden life, even with love, would have had no delights for her, still less a life mingled with shame. She knew no romances, and had only a feeble share in the feelings which are the source of romance, so that well-read ladies may find it difficult to understand her state of mind. She was too ignorant of everything beyond the simple notions and habits in which she had been brought up, to have any more definite idea of her probable future than that Arthur would take care of her somehow, and shelter her from anger and scorn. He would not marry her and make her a lady, and apart from that she could think of nothing he could give towards which she looked with longing and ambition. The next morning she rose early, and taking only some milk and bread for her breakfast, set out to walk on the road towards Ashby, under a leaden-coloured sky, with a narrowing streak of yellow, like a departing hope, on the edge of the horizon. Now, in her faintness of heart at the length and difficulty of her journey, she was most of all afraid of spending her money, and becoming so destitute that she would have to ask people's charity. For Hetty had the pride not only of a proud nature, but of a proud class, the class that pays the most poor rates, and most shudders at the idea of profiting by a poor rate. It had not yet occurred to her that she might get money for her locket and earrings which she carried with her, and she applied all her small arithmetic and knowledge of prices to calculating how many meals and how many rides were contained in her 2 guineas, and the odd shillings, which had a melancholy look, as if they were the pale ashes of the other bright flaming coin. For the first few miles out of Stoniton she walked on bravely, always fixing on some tree or gate or projecting bush at the most distant visible point in the road as a goal, and feeling a faint joy when she had reached it. But when she came to the 4th milestone, the first she had happened to notice among the long grass by the roadside, and read that she was still only 4 miles beyond Stoniton, her courage sank. She had come only this little way, and yet felt tired, and almost hungry again in the keen morning air, for though Hetty was accustomed to much movement and exertion indoors, she was not used to long walks which produced quite a different sort of fatigue from that of household activity. As she was looking at the milestone, she felt some drops falling on her face. It was beginning to rain. Here was a new trouble which had not entered into her sad thoughts before, and quite weighed down by this sudden addition to her burden, she sat down on the step of a stile and began to sob hysterically. The beginning of hardship is like the first taste of bitter food. It seems for a moment unbearable, yet if there is nothing else to satisfy our hunger, we take another bite and find it possible to go on. When Hetty recovered from her burst of weeping, she rallied her fainting courage. It was raining, and she must try to get on to a village where she might find rest and shelter. Presently, as she walked on wearily, she heard the rumbling of heavy wheels behind her. A covered waggon was coming, creeping slowly along with a slouching driver cracking his whip beside the horses. She waited for it, thinking that if the waggoner were not a very sour-looking man, she would ask him to take her up. As the waggon approached her, the driver had fallen behind, but there was something in the front of the big vehicle which encouraged her. At any previous moment in her life she would not have noticed it, but now the new susceptibility that suffering had awakened in her caused this object to impress her strongly. It was only a small white and liver-coloured spaniel which sat on the front ledge of the waggon, with large timid eyes and an incessant trembling in the body, such as you may have seen in some of these small creatures. Hetty cared little for animals, as you know, but at this moment she felt as if the helpless timid creature had some fellowship with her, and without being quite aware of the reason, she was less doubtful about speaking to the driver, who now came forward, a large ruddy man with a sack over his shoulders, by way of scarf or mantle. "Could you take me up in your waggon if you're going towards Ashby?" said Hetty. "I'll pay you for it." "Oh," said the big fellow, with that slowly dawning smile which belongs to heavy faces, "I can take you up fast enough without being paid for it, if you don't mind lying a bit closish atop of the wool-packs. Where do you come from, and what do you want at Ashby?" "I come from Stoniton. I'm going a long way, to Windsor." "What? Arter some service, or what?" "Going to my brother, he's a soldier there." "Well, I'm going no furder nor Leicester, and fur enough too, but I'll take you, if you don't mind being a bit long on the road. The hosses won't feel your weight no more nor they feel the little doog there, as I puck up on the road a fortnight ago. He war lost, I believe, and's been all of a tremble iver sin'. Come, gie us your basket, and come behind and let me put you in." To lie on the wool-packs, with a cranny left between the curtains of the awning to let in the air, was luxury to Hetty now, and she half slept away the hours till the driver came to ask her if she wanted to get down and have some victual. He himself was going to eat his dinner at this public. Late at night they reached Leicester, and so this second day of Hetty's journey was past. She had spent no money except what she had paid for her food, but she felt that this slow journeying would be intolerable for her another day, and in the morning she found her way to a coach office to ask about the road to Windsor, and see if it would cost her too much to go part of the distance by coach again. Yes, the distance was too great, the coaches were too dear, she must give them up. But the elderly clerk at the office, touched by her pretty anxious face, wrote down for her the names of the chief places she must pass through. This was the only comfort she got in Leicester, for the men stared at her as she went along the street, and for the first time in her life Hetty wished no one would look at her. She set out walking again, but this day she was fortunate, for she was soon overtaken by a carrier's cart which carried her to Hinckley, and by the help of a return chaise, with a drunken postilion, who frightened her by driving like Jehu the son of Nimshi, and shouting hilarious remarks at her, twisting himself backwards on his saddle, she was before night in the heart of woody Warwickshire, but still almost 100 miles from Windsor, they told her. Oh, what a large world it was, and what hard work for her to find her way in it. She went by mistake to Stratford-on-Avon, finding Stratford set down in her list of places, and then she was told she had come a long way out of the right road. It was not till the 5th day that she got to Stony Stratford. That seems but a slight journey as you look at the map, or remember your own pleasant travels to and from the meadowy banks of the Avon. But how wearily long it was to Hetty! It seemed to her as if this country of flat fields and hedgerows and dotted houses and villages and market towns, all so much alike to her indifferent eyes, must have no end, and she must go on wandering among them for ever, waiting tired at toll-gates for some cart to come, and then finding the cart went only a little way, a very little way, to the miller's a mile off perhaps, and she hated going into the public houses where she must go to get food and ask questions, because there were always men lounging there who stared at her and joked her rudely. Her body was very weary too, with these days of new fatigue and anxiety. They had made her look more pale and worn than all the time of hidden dread she had gone through at home. When at last she reached Stony Stratford, her impatience and weariness had become too strong for her economical caution. She determined to take the coach for the rest of the way, though it should cost her all her remaining money. She would need nothing at Windsor but to find Arthur. When she had paid the fare for the last coach, she had only a shilling, and as she got down at the sign of the Green Man in Windsor at 12 o'clock in the middle of the 7th day, hungry and faint, the coachman came up, and begged her to remember him. She put her hand in her pocket and took out the shilling, but the tears came with the sense of exhaustion and the thought that she was giving away her last means of getting food, which she really required before she could go in search of Arthur. As she held out the shilling, she lifted up her dark, tear-filled eyes to the coachman's face and said, "Can you give me back 6pence?" "No, no," he said gruffly. "Never mind, put the shilling up again." The landlord of the Green Man had stood near enough to witness this scene, and he was a man whose abundant feeding served to keep his good nature, as well as his person, in high condition, and that lovely tearful face of Hetty's would have found out the sensitive fibre in most men. "Come, young woman, come in," he said, "and have a drop of something. You're pretty well knocked up, I can see that." He took her into the bar and said to his wife, "Here, missus, take this young woman into the parlour. She's a little overcome." For Hetty's tears were falling fast. They were merely hysterical tears. She thought she had no reason for weeping now, and was vexed that she was too weak and tired to help it. She was at Windsor at last, not far from Arthur. She looked with eager, hungry eyes at the bread and meat and beer that the landlady brought her, and for some minutes she forgot everything else in the delicious sensations of satisfying hunger and recovering from exhaustion. The landlady sat opposite to her as she ate, and looked at her earnestly. No wonder Hetty had thrown off her bonnet, and her curls had fallen down. Her face was all the more touching in its youth and beauty because of its weary look, and the good woman's eyes presently wandered to her figure, which in her hurried dressing on her journey she had taken no pains to conceal. Moreover, the stranger's eye detects what the familiar unsuspecting eye leaves unnoticed. "Why, you're not very fit for travelling," she said, glancing while she spoke at Hetty's ringless hand. "Have you come far?" "Yes," said Hetty, roused by this question to exert more self-command, and feeling the better for the food she had taken. "I've come a good long way, and it's very tiring, but I'm better now. Could you tell me which way to go to this place?" Here Hetty took from her pocket a bit of paper. It was the end of Arthur's letter on which he had written his address. While she was speaking, the landlord had come in and had begun to look at her as earnestly as his wife had done. He took up the piece of paper which Hetty handed across the table and read the address. "Why, what do you want at this house?" he said. "It is in the nature of innkeepers and all men who have no pressing business of their own to ask as many questions as possible before giving any information." "I want to see a gentleman as is there," said Hetty. "But there's no gentleman there," returned the landlord. "It's shut up. Been shut up this fortnight. What gentleman is it you want? Perhaps I can let you know where to find him." "It's Captain Donnithorne," said Hetty tremulously, her heart beginning to beat painfully at this disappointment of her hope that she should find Arthur at once. "Captain Donnithorne? Stop a bit," said the landlord slowly. "Was he in the Loamshire militia? A tall young officer with a fairish skin and reddish whiskers, and had a servant by the name of Pym?" "Oh, yes," said Hetty. "You know him? Where is he?" "A fine sight o' miles away from here. The Loamshire militia's gone to Ireland. It's been gone this fortnight." "Look there, she's fainting," said the landlady, hastening to support Hetty, who had lost her miserable consciousness and looked like a beautiful corpse. They carried her to the sofa and loosened her dress. "Here's a bad business, I suspect," said the landlord, as he brought in some water. "Ah, it's plain enough what sort of business it is," said the wife. "She's not a common flaunting dratchel, I can see that. She looks like a respectable country girl, and she comes from a good way off, to judge by her tongue. She talks something like that ostler we had that come from the north. He was as honest a fellow as we ever had about the house. They're all honest folks in the north." "I never saw a prettier young woman in my life," said the husband. "She's like a pictur in a shop winder. It goes to one's art to look at her." "It'd have been a good deal better for her if she'd been uglier and had more conduct," said the landlady, who on any charitable construction must have been supposed to have more conduct than beauty. "But she's coming to again. Fetch a drop more water." End of chapter 36. Recording by Tony Ashworth, Brisbane, Australia.